Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this month's sustainability webinar. Now, after a lot of talk, finally, we're getting into the details of AASB S2. And this month, we're starting with the first pillar and we focus on governance. So, welcome to this webinar. My name is Aletta Boshoff, and I'm the national leader at BDO for two areas, the one sustainability and the other IFRS and corporate reporting. And you can see my contact details there if you would like to reach out to me to discuss anything further. BDO would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. And we pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Now, this is the third sustainability webinar for this year, but the webinars have been running for many years now. In January, we talked about the year ahead, and 2025 is a big year for sustainability reporting. Last month, we did a strategic look at sustainability, and we shared some insights from the BDO CFO Outlook survey with some very interesting findings. And then this month, we're starting that real deep dive into AASB S2, looking at Pillar 1 governance. And then you'll see over the next coming months up to October, we look at various aspects of AASB S2. It will not just be these are the disclosure requirements. We say these are the disclosure requirements, but what data, what information, what building blocks do you need in order to meet the disclosure requirements? And then we also try and provide some guidance on how do you execute on some of those projects. So quite an in-depth discussion of AASB 2 over 2, 4, 6, 8 months. And then in November, we'll look at bringing it together for that first report. So if you're a 31 December year-end client, Group 1, it will be just in time for you, but for others, there might be time to do a dry run and circulate it with all executives and board members to get comfort over that dry run report. And then in December, we look at assurance in particular and how to make sure we're assurance ready. I just want to say that throughout every section, we try and focus on assurance ready. We believe that at BDO, the value we bring to our clients around sustainability reporting and mandatory sustainability reporting is we help our clients to be assurance ready. So that will be embedded in every webinar. We also do monthly IFRS and corporate reporting webinars, and I do want to give a shout out to one of our IFRS partners, Dean Arden, who presented last week an amazing session on accounting for power purchase agreements. He gave such a wonderful overview of what it is, how it fits into sustainability, the electricity markets in Australia, and then ultimately, if you enter into these arrangements, what are the accounting considerations? So if you are entering into power purchase agreements or even thinking about entering into those, please reach out to us, and there's a recording available that you can watch. There are the IFRS topics for the rest of the year that you can also register for or get your finance team to register for. The Carbon Accounting Masterclasses, the March 2025 roadshow is coming to an end. Yesterday, Kevin Frobers and Tom Dart presented the masterclass here in Sydney. We finished on Friday. Ashley presented one in Perth, and I've done the virtual one last week and the Melbourne one on the 4th of March. On Friday, we've got one left. It's the Brisbane masterclass. On Friday, Tom Hogben will be presenting that, and you can still register for that. And then you'll see I've put a little red block there. It's amazing the ongoing demand for these masterclasses. A number of people are saying, Aletta, you've done it May last year, you've done it in November, we've now done it in March. When's the next one? I've missed registration, or I had something on, etc. And therefore, we've scheduled ongoing virtual masterclasses that will be presented quarterly throughout 2026, and I suspect through 27, 28, as more and more entities have to do mandatory sustainability reporting, which includes carbon accounting. So it's a whole education program that we're rolling out. I think at this stage, quarterly will only be virtual. If we have significant demand in various locations, we might do face-to-face, but I'll be presenting those virtual masterclasses. Look out for the next one in June. Then last month, we've touched on this. I've had some further questions and discussions with clients, so I'd like to come back to this, and that is the new approved sustainability. Sorry, just a second. I'm always worried they want to try and get hold of me because something is not working on the webinar. I'll just double check. All right. The new approved Australian Sustainability Assurance Standards. Now, there are two standards that's been issued in Australia. ASSA 5000, the general requirements for sustainability assurance engagements, but then also very important, ASSA 5010, the timeline for audits and reviews of information in sustainability report under the Corps Act. So very specific to Australia. This is the final diagram. It's been updated. Asterisk number 1, they further explained it because there was a bit of confusion on whether this phasing applies to reporting and assurance or just assurance. So it looks as if, so they've tried to clarify it. What we have done is we've put together a table to make it, I think, crystal clear. So if you're, for example, a Group 1 entity and your financial year is commencing from 1 January to 30 June, so somewhere in that period. So for example, if your year is starting on the 1st of January, the first year end that you have to do mandatory sustainability reporting is actually 31 December 2025 and then 26, 27. For that group of entities, what does that phasing look like? And you can see for every year, we've distinguished between what does the reporting look like in that year, and then what does assurance look like in that year. So here you can see 31 December 2025, and you have to do reporting of absolutely everything except for scope 3, but you've got limited assurance over only 3 sections. And then if you look at 31 December 2026, you have to do scope 3, everything from a reporting perspective, but still only limited assurance, or another year of limited assurance over only 3 sections. So the first year that these entities will be disclosing scope 3 emissions, there will actually be no assurance over it. Now, the picture is somewhat different if you're a Group 1 entity and your years are starting between 1 July and 31 December. So the first years that you will do reporting for will be 30 June 26 and then 27, 28. So in your very first year, again, you have to do reporting of everything except for scope 3. You'll have limited assurance over 3 sections. And then in the next year, 30 June 27, you go to disclosing absolutely everything, including scope 3. And from day 1, there will be limited assurance over scope 3 emissions. So there's a slight difference on how the reporting and the assurance work together, depending on whether you're a Group 1 entity with years starting between 1 January and 30 June, as opposed to years starting from 1 July to 31 December. Now, this phasing and this special situation only impacts Group 1 entities, because for Group 2 it's somewhat clearer, as well as for Group 3. So I just wanted to clarify that, make 100% sure everybody's across the detail. A lot of discussion and debate about that. So if we come back to today's session, where we're looking at the importance of governance, or the disclosures around governance, I think it's important to take a step back and say, Why is governance important? Why is it in there? Why do we start with governance, and also discuss how this really sets the scene for everything we do? So I think that's an important starting place. So the importance of governance, I found a wonderful document on the TCFD website, and I might just have to explain this. Remember, for many years, and actually still today, we've got a recommendation by the ASX, by ASIC, by APRA, that organizations should voluntarily disclose their climate risk opportunities and other disclosures voluntarily using the TCFD recommendations. And if you use the TCFD recommendations, it's usually in your director's report as part of the OFR. Now, those TCFD recommendations and the whole body has been absorbed into the International Sustainability Standards Board, and AASB S2 has been built onto the TCFD recommendations. Actually, the TCFD recommendations form the foundation for what we now have in AASB S2 and IFRS S2. Therefore, a piece of advice: whenever you are looking for additional information, explanations, guidance on anything in AASB S2, a fantastic place to go is the TCFD website, which still exists, which is still valid, which is still relevant, because they've done amazing work over the years to help people along the journey. So, it's still relevant. So if you look at that TCFD governance workshop, they're talking about disclosing governance practices provides important context for investors and other users of disclosure. So we start with governance practices, so investors can see how an organization looks at this, how important it is, how it is embedded. So that context is incredibly important. Then they've gone on and said that investors and other users of these climate-related financial disclosures are interested in understanding the role the company's board plays in overseeing climate-related issues, as well as management's role in assessing and managing those issues. So that's the idea of there's the board level, those charged with governance, and there's the management level. Interesting, when we work with clients, there's always the two presentations we do. There's a presentation potentially to management or executive talking about a lot of details around climate-related disclosures and how we're going to execute and the projects and the project plans. And management is usually all over it. But then there's also that other presentation and interaction with the board, because ultimately the board is responsible. So, what is the board's role? How do we update them? When do we update them? Their responsibility, especially now that it's embedded in the Corps Act, and it's got an impact on directors' liabilities, etc. So there's a role for the board and there's a role for management, and users want to know what that role is. And then it's important that the reason they ask for that is the information support their evaluations. So this is potential investors, financiers, evaluations on whether climate-related issues receive, and I've underlined it, appropriate board and management attention. So there's two key things here. Governance disclosures give the users context, and it gives us information on whether there's appropriate board and management attention. Ultimately, the aim of disclosure of financial reports and mandatory sustainability reports are providing decision useful information to investors and other users. So all of this works towards that decision useful information. So this is the importance of governance, and none of this has ever changed. Now, interestingly, I looked at all these TCFD reports. I love looking at their information. They've done amazing work. And in their 2020 status report, they did a status report every year. They said they've conducted a survey to identify specific climate-related information that users of this information find most useful when they make their decisions. Now, I very strongly believe that you only disclose information that assists with the decisions that users make. And I think that's how all standards have been developed over the years. Conceptually, that's what we're trying to do, address user needs. Now, this survey, they said based on the survey to understand what's most useful, they've identified the following types of governance information as most useful. And in all the webinars, I'll discuss other aspects as well, but I've got to focus on what part of governance disclosures have they found most useful. The first one, how the board considers climate-related issues when they oversee major capital expenditures, when they oversee acquisitions, and when they oversee divestments. So what this is saying to us is we would like to know that the board, when they consider major capital expenditure or acquisitions or divestments, that somewhere in that process there's a consideration of climate-related issues. And they find that useful to know that the board actually is involved. Also, how the board considers climate-related issues when reviewing and guiding strategy. So if we have an amazing strategy, but we've completely ignored climate risk and opportunities, users would like to know that. And then also they would like some information on the description of management's role in all of that. So interesting that even that the surveys from users who usually draft and influence and dictate what we require in accounting standards and also sustainability disclosure standards have a big focus on governance, which says governance is very important. Now, before we look at AASB S2, I always like to go back to the TCFD recommendations because that's the foundation of what we have today. It's been built on this. Now, if you look at these recommendations, I'm really particularly interested in this diagram. Because you can see we've got this big circle of governance. And then within governance, we get to strategy and embedding climate-related risks and opportunities then in strategy. And then it boils down to how we manage risk in our business. And then finally, we get to metrics and targets. So this diagram, I think, is a wonderful illustration of how governance covers everything. Governance is the starting point. Governance directs everything. It's the safety net around absolutely everything. A lot of businesses start with metrics, start with measuring carbon footprint and setting targets. But actually what the standards require and the TCFD recommendations require is that we create governance. Now, we see this in very many aspects. I'll use another example. If you look at implementing or considering how you bring AI into your organization, which everybody's talking about, and what we're talking about at BDO Australia as well, where did we start? Where do most businesses start? What is the governance around AI? Then you think about the strategy and other aspects. So governance is always the first place, and the same for climate-related financial disclosures. Now, when we look at these TCFD recommendations, 4 pillars, exactly the same 4 pillars as AASB S2. And in the governance pillar, the only recommendation at a high level is you describe the board's oversight of climate-related risks and opportunities. And then separate to that, describe management's role in assessing and managing climate-related risk and opportunity. This is based on their research, on their survey, so a distinction between the board and management. And we still have this distinction in AASB S2. What they've then also done in the recommendations is they've provided some guidance. So, for example, the first one described the board's oversight of climate-related risk and opportunities. These are guidance for all sectors. What are the kind of things that you should be disclosing? Now, there's another way to think about this. This is guidance on the things, the processes you should be implementing at your business. And then once it's implemented, you can then disclose that as part of your mandatory sustainability report. So people often ask, Aletta, to do these disclosures, what do we have to implement today to be able to disclose the right things? These are very good examples. So we will have to say, you have to describe board's oversight of these issues, and you should consider some of the following things in that document. What are the processes and the frequency by which the board or the committees are informed about climate-related issues? So what's the process to inform the board? And how often do we inform the board? Then we also have whether the board or the committees consider risks when they review their strategy, their major plans of action, their annual your budgets, etc. So in all these different things, do we have a criteria when the board is looking at something? Have we considered climate-related risks and opportunities? This new infrastructure project, this new acquisition, etc. So building it in all those existing processes that you have. And then also how the board monitors and oversees progress against goals and targets for addressing climate-related issues. So if the organization is setting goals and targets, how does the board monitor that? You can't just set the target and no follow-up. How often do they get informed, etc.? Then the other one, when we go down to management, again, these are the things management should be thinking of implementing. Have we assigned climate-related responsibilities to various management level positions and committees? And if so, which management committees? And how is it included in their charter, for example? How does it fit into our organizational structures? It's really important that climate and sustainability is not sitting outside the normal governance structure, but it's embedded in existing structures. Processes by which management is informed about these issues, and also how do they monitor these issues. Right, so these are the types of things that we have to implement, embed in existing systems and processes in order to be able to disclose this. The TCFD recommendations, by the way, there are recommendations, those 4 pillars, 11 high-level recommendations, and then they provide information on recommended disclosures. They've got guidance for sectors and specific guidance for specific sectors like financial services or banks or etc. So there's a lot of documents available for you to consider. Now, the other thing that is really interesting, and I think there's so much we can learn from the TCFD, is they did a bit of research over the period 2018 to 2020. And although this is a number of years ago, I think still very reflective of what we're seeing. And that is they've looked at the various recommendations across the 4 pillars. You can see the next column is the 11 recommendations. Then they have a percentage change. So that is to what extent the disclosures have increased, because all of them, luckily, when I looked at it, all of them has increased over the 3 years. But if we focus on governance, and if you look at board oversight, disclosures around board oversight was 9% of organizations disclosed board oversight. It went up to 13%, and then by FY 2020, it was 25%. And then if you look at the management's role, it started 9% of organizations disclosed that, increased to 11%, and then up to 18%. So I think the trajectory is what we're looking for, and there's an increase and in disclosures. What's interesting, though, if you look at this graph and look at it at a static point in time, that from a strategy perspective, 52% of businesses by FY 2020 were disclosing climate-related risk and opportunities, which is a lot more than the disclosures around governance. 44% of businesses were disclosing climate-related metrics. Again, huge number of entities that's embraced the strategic risk management metrics and targets disclosures, but it really looks as if governance have been a little bit left behind. But government's really important, sets the context, and knows whether the leaders are paying the necessary attention. The other thing that's interesting is when the TCFD engaged with organizations around these climate-related disclosures, a lot of businesses says we've got a bit of a challenge. And our challenge is that our governance practices apply to all issues, all sustainability issues in particular, not just climate issues. So do you as a TCFD want us to have separate governance for climate that sits separate to sustainability, that sits separate to all our other governance processes, maybe around AI, etc.? And then at the last block there, they made it very clear, and I absolutely agree with this, and I'm a big advocate for this, that it's important that you clearly describe your governance processes, and it's clear that people understand that these processes are comprehensive processes, and that climate-related issues are just one aspect covered by these processes. What I mean by this, when we work with businesses, instead of taking all their governance processes and uplifting it to include climate-related issues, and then in a few years' time, update it to reflect nature-related issues, and then update to reflect workforce issues as more and more AASB S's are issued, I think it's more efficient and effective to update governance processes to address all relevant sustainability issues, so that our governance processes can deal with more sustainability disclosure standards, more topics, and that we don't every time have to go through this whole process of updating governance processes. So you don't need a climate committee. It could be a sustainability committee that initially just focus on climate. And over time, as we've got more sustainability aspects, they will focus on more aspects. Or it could be the audit and risk committee now also look at the mandatory sustainability report. It's in their remit, their mandate. Initially, they will just focus on climate, but as that mandatory sustainability report evolve in Australia, we'll add other issues, but we don't have to redo their mandate, etc. So I think we have to kind of keep an eye on the future and future-proof some of these governance processes and documents as we go from a practical perspective. So that's TCFD. Remember, that's the foundation. If we now add on top of that AASB S2, the overall objective of AASB S2 across all the pillars is that entities disclose climate-related risks and opportunities to primary users of this general purpose finance, so investors, providers of financing, in making decisions. So for me, it's important. Climate-related risk of opportunities, primary users making decisions. Three key things. They further explain you look at climate-related risk and opportunities that could reasonably be expected to affect an entity's cash flows, its access to finance, or its cost of capital over the short, medium, or long term. And important to have that perspective. It's not just something that impacts my cash flows. It could potentially impact my access to financing, and maybe the cost of that financing, or the cost of capital, which is not just debt capital, but also equity capital. And it doesn't have to be just of the short term. It could be short term, medium term, or long term, right? So it's quite broad, reasonably expected to impact any of these items, even over the long term. Actually, really, really hard, in my humble opinion, to argue that climate change does not impact your cash flows, access to finance, cost of capital over the short, medium, or long term. Really hard to justify that. When we look at the scope of AASB S2, I want to I've put this in here to reiterate that climate-related risks cover physical risks, absolutely, but it also covers transition risks. A lot of people think physical risk and then they say AASB S2 don't apply to us. We're not in a flood zone. We're not in a fire zone. You know, physical climate related, more cyclones, etc. It's not an issue for us where we're located. It's because those businesses only think about physical risks. This standard also applies to transition risks, and I'll touch on what a transition risk is shortly. The other thing is it's not just risk, it's also opportunities. And the only time that you've got climate-related risk and opportunities outside the scope of AASB S2 is if it could not reasonably be expected to affect your prospects. Again, I find it hard to argue that. Now, I go back to my favorite TCFD. They've got a beautiful diagram where they articulate how transition risk, physical risk, all those risks impact strategy, risk management, and ultimately financials. But also how opportunities have to be considered. So it's risks and opportunities. Can you see on this diagram that your physical risks are a very small part of the consideration? It's part of it, but it's also transition risk. It's also opportunities. Now, in the TCFD, they've got an overview booklet. I found this little bit of gold. People often ask us, Aletta, you talk about transition risk. Just tell us again, what is a transition risk? We understand financial risk. What's a transition risk? I think this diagram, which is just an expansion of the previous one, explains it well. Where you look at policy and legal risks, so will we have carbon pricing and reporting obligations over the long term? Question. If you say yes, it impacts your business, you should consider it. Do we have mandates on and regulation of existing products and services? So this is not just reporting. This is about disclosing carbon embedded in products. Do we have exposure to litigation if we get this wrong? Technology, substitution of existing products and services with lower emissions options. So technology, if you think diesel vehicles being replaced by EVs, that's a technology change. Unsuccessful investment in new technologies could be a risk. Market, changing customer behavior. Are we seeing a change in customer behavior around our products and our services linked to climate change or carbon emissions? Are there uncertainty in market signals? Now, maybe there aren't changing behaviors yet for your products, but there's some market signals that it might be coming. You don't want to be, being caught too slow to react. What about the increased cost of raw materials? A reputation, again, there's a shift in customer preferences, increased stakeholder concern or negative feedback around your business. Maybe there's a stigmatization of the sector you're operating in. All of these are risks, transition risks. It's just a few examples that should be considered before you say this has got nothing to do with me. And then on the right-hand side, we have some opportunities. I don't want to focus on that today. So if you look at AASB S2, interestingly, the same 4 pillars than the TCFD recommendations, 11 key sections, which interestingly aligns to the 11 recommendations of the TCFD recommendations. And if you look at governance, exactly the same 2 subsections. governance around those charged with governance, the board, and governance around management. So a bit of an introduction to AASB S2. If we now go on to Pillar 1 and look at governance, the objective of governance disclosures, and they're articulated in the standard. The objective is to enable the users to understand your governance processes, your governance controls, and your procedures. So this is a call to action. Have another look at your governance processes, controls, and procedures that you already have, and consider how the entity uses all of those to monitor, to manage, to oversee climate-related risks and opportunities. So, you might have fantastic governance to monitor, to manage, and oversee other risks and opportunities, but to clearly articulate it also addresses climate-related risks and opportunities. Now, this pillar is split into responsibilities of those charged with governance and then also management. There are 9 disclosures around governance, but what I've tried to do on the presentation today is break them down and highlight potential subsections that's easy to overlook and might get you into trouble. So let's look at the first one, and this is we're focusing on those charged with governance. An entity shall, so please note, TCFD recommendations is a friendly recommend voluntary disclosure, high level. If you look at AASB S2, we now find the word shall. And I've put shall in red everywhere because it's really clear that there's no way around this. The entity shall disclose information about the governance body or individuals responsible for oversight of climate-related risks and opportunities. So the entity shall identify the bodies or individuals. And then explanatory information, these bodies could be a board, it could be a committee, or an equivalent body charged with governance. Usually we see it as the board, maybe a subcommittee reporting to the board, but ultimately sits with the board. So you have to identify the bodies or individuals. So be very clear on that. Now, interestingly, if you don't have a body or an individual responsible for climate-related risks and opportunities, you can meet this requirement by saying, we do not have a governance body or individual responsible for oversight of climate risk and opportunities. You would be compliant with the standard if you disclose that, but then I would say, is that what you want to disclose about your business? So remember, this is just a disclosure. You disclose what is fact in your business. So who are these governance bodies and individuals? If you look at the second disclosure, the entity shall disclose information about how responsibilities for climate-related risk and opportunities are reflected. So it's not good enough to say the board is responsible. You now have to say, how did you incorporate this additional responsibility of the board, for example, in the terms of reference of the board or the terms of reference of a subcommittee, the terms of, or however you include that responsibilities in mandates, in role descriptions of individuals, or other related policies. So really what we're saying here, this is what you have to disclose, but what you have to do today is you have to go and look at all of your terms of reference, your mandates, your role descriptions, your policies, and make sure you've updated that to incorporate these new responsibilities of your board, if it's the board's responsibility in your organization. The other alternative, and you don't want to go there, we've not updated it. If you haven't updated it, but you said they're responsible, nobody's going to believe that disclosure then. All right, so how did you follow through? The entity shall disclose information about how the bodies or individuals determine whether appropriate skills and competencies are available or will be developed. So the focus here is on appropriate skills and competencies. So if you've said, for example, that the board is responsible for climate-related risks and opportunities, but if we look at the skills matrix of the board and none of them have the skills or the competencies to take on this new responsibility, again, that is the truth, wouldn't reflect well with users and investors. So what can you do today? Make sure you add in the skills matrix a consideration on whether board members have awareness of sustainability, and if they don't have it, let's have a look at how it can be developed and at least say we don't have it available, but this is how it will be developed. Or you can disclose we have, it is available because we've done training, we've done these webinars, we've done board updates, etc. So if they were to oversee strategies around climate-related risk and opportunities, what are the appropriate skills and competencies on your board, and how will it be developed? You also have to disclose how and how often these bodies or individuals is informed about climate-related risk and opportunities. So if management is reporting to them, how? Is it a report? Is it a verbal update? Is it an email? So how are they updated and how often? And let's say we say management responsible for risk and opportunity, climate-related risk and opportunities will update the board quarterly. And they do it through a updated a board meeting. There's a paper and a presentation, an opportunity for board to ask questions. So how do you update the board and how often? Then also the entity shall disclose information about how the body or individuals that's now responsible around the board level take into account climate-related risk and opportunities. So how do we factor it in when we look at our entity's strategy? So if you've been working on a brand new strategy for your business and you disclose your strategy, but nowhere in that strategy there's any reference of climate-related risk and opportunities has at least be considered. So when we talk about strategy, how do we think about climate risk and opportunities? If we do any major transactions, whether it's acquisitions, divestments, major infrastructure, how do we embed climate risk and opportunities in those processes and thinking? If you look at your risk management processes and policies, how do you embed climate-related risk and opportunities? And then also, very specifically, disclose whether the bodies or individuals has considered trade-offs associated with those risks and opportunities. Now, there's often you have to make certain trade-offs because between various risks and opportunities, and how did they do that? Have they considered trade-offs? So this is one disclosure requirement, but it actually asks for a lot more. It asks for information around strategy, major decision, risk processes, and trade-offs. Now, the sixth disclosure, and it's still busy with the board, the entity shall disclose on how the board oversees setting of targets related to climate-related opportunities. So how do they oversee setting of targets? How do they monitor progress towards those targets? And also how they oversee whether and how performance metrics are included in remuneration policies. Right? Now, be careful here. You'll see I've put in green there, the standard refers to additional paragraphs. So there's a linkage. You have to be very specific. It's not just the board oversees setting of targets, the board monitors progress, or the board considers remuneration policies. The emphasis here is how does the board oversee this? So you have to be very specific. How do the board oversee setting of targets? What's their exact involvement? How do the board monitor progress towards those targets, etc.? So I want to give you an idea. There's a reference to other paragraphs. Now, I'm not going to read all of it, but I've put snippets in here. They are asking how the board monitors progress towards targets, and then they say refer to paragraphs 33 to 36. So it really is saying how do the board monitor and get involved in the metric that's used to set the target, the objective of the target, the period over which the target applies, the base period. So you can't oversee targets if you're not getting into this nitty-gritty outlined in paragraphs 33 to 36. What's the methodology, the processes, the GHG emissions, and that's why so many board members have to get their head around carbon accounting, greenhouse gas emissions. There's a section on carbon credits. How do the board oversee whether we'll be using carbon credits or not? And then remuneration, which is paragraph 29G, the entity has to disclose a description of whether and how climate considerations are factored into executive remuneration, and the board has to oversee this process. And then the board also has to oversee the percentage of executive and management remuneration recognized in the period. So it's not just we do X, Y, and Z, it's how do we do it, and there's details required on their involvement. Now, 6 disclosures around the board. A lot of detail there and a lot of work required. But if you look at management, an entity shall disclose information about management's role in a number of things, your governance processes, your controls, your procedures. And that the processes, the controls, the procedures that's used to monitor, to manage, and oversee climate-related risk and opportunities. So what's management role? We've started with what the board does, but what does management do? So you'll have to look at these individual management committees and these individual, not just the committees, but the position descriptions of management on how does that now also incorporate climate-related risk and opportunities. Then an entity shall disclose information about whether the role is delegated to a specific management level position or a management level committee. So it's delegated to the CFO, it's delegated to the Chief Sustainability Officer, or it's delegated to a sustainability committee or climate committee. And then also, yes, it's delegated to them, but how oversight is exercised over that position or committee. So it's not just we delegate to you, how do we oversee what they do, when do they report? And then also around management, you have to disclose whether management uses controls and procedures to support the oversight, and also, importantly, whether those controls and procedures are integrated with other internal functions. And I personally believe integration is incredibly important. So you can see there's a lot of disclosures around governance. I would say it's not good enough to just look at a disclosure checklist and say, this is what I have to disclose, 9 things. I mean, each of these 9 things have a lot more to it. Getting ready now is more around, have we done these things? And in order to be assurance ready, you can't disclose things to meet a disclosure requirement without having evidence that you've actually done it. So from an assurance perspective, if you've said the board is now responsible for climate-related risk and opportunities, and they've got the skills, and they have it on their agenda quarterly, they receive updates, I would like you to be able to show the auditors, here are the board agendas. Here you can see climate risk and opportunities have been included quarterly. Here are the agenda papers of what the board has been updated on, or the board has had training. This is the training they attended. So you need to build the data that support what you're ultimately going to disclose in order to be assurance ready. There are some explanatory paragraphs as well around governance. they say avoid unnecessary duplication. And what they mean by that is, in Australia, because we've not adopted mandatorily AASB S1, the general sustainability standard, if you've got general sustainability related risks and opportunities, and you've got governance processes around those, and it also includes climate-related risks and opportunities, you don't have to say, these are my sustainability risks and opportunities, and then repeat that this also is my climate-related risk and opportunities. To talk about sustainability risk and opportunities, which includes climate at the moment, maybe also others in future, or already other aspects, that is good. We don't want unnecessary duplication. Just be very clear. And then there's an Australian specific paragraph AAS 7.1. So as soon as you see an AAS in front of a paragraph, it's Australia specific. It's not in IFRS S2. And again, they talk about the requirement to avoid unnecessary duplication applies particularly if an entity voluntarily applies AASB S1, so they do all the general requirements. So they've gone for that voluntarily. Now you don't have to repeat all of the overlapping disclosures if it also applies to AASB S2. So we've got that relief. A few questions that I'm going to pose to you as webinar attendees to think about. Are the responsibilities of the board and management clearly defined? Responsibilities around climate-related risks and opportunities. Is it clearly defined? Is it clearly documented? Very important, you need that because that will support what you ultimately disclose. Next question, does your company already have governance processes and bodies in place that explicitly address climate-related issues? Maybe these processes are in place. Maybe it's not properly documented, but it's in place. If it's in place, document it. If it's in place and documented, make sure you've got the evidence support that it's effective, it's efficient, it's implemented. It's not just words on a piece of paper. If you don't have it, you have to put it in place. Do we have data available to meet the disclosure requirements relating to governance? So there's a lot of things we have to disclose around governance. So the skills of the board, the various committees, how we've updated mandates, how often the board is updated, how the board oversees targets. So do we have that information? Do we have the building blocks in order to do the disclosure and get assurance over that disclosure? Then finally, and I don't think this is the most important, but I do want to put it out there, do you have a AASB S2 disclosure checklist, particularly around governance? Now, what we're working on at the moment is we'll provide this disclosure checklist as we go, as we discuss it every month. And this disclosure checklist, I've done the 9 disclosures that we've discussed today. And you can see I've tried to make it the number of disclosures. The disclosure requirement, I've broken it down with bullet points because I want to flush out with those bullet points that it's not just one little disclosure. There are key parts to it that sometimes gets hidden away in one sentence. So number 4, has the entity disclosed information about how and how often the bodies or individuals is informed about climate-related risks and opportunities, right? So this is at a governance level, those charged with governance. So there's 2 things, how and how often. If we just put it in a sentence so easy to miss, I've also put in the AASB S2 reference, and then comments is for you to make comments on, yes, we've got it in place, no, we have to get it, or yes, it's in place, it's not documented. So there's action items for you. So it's a disclosure checklist, but the idea is to drive actions to get ready for these disclosures. And there are the others, number 6, 7, 8, and 9. and we'll do that as we go over the webinars. I've also then wrapped up the webinar by doing research. I've actually had a student look at the ASX 200, look at and their reports for 2024. We've got them all downloaded, and we've done a bit of an analysis. Now, obviously, and I just want to say that up front, there are currently no AASB S2 examples available, because the first entities that will have to comply with AASB S2 will be 31 December 2025. So there are no AASB S2 examples available because it's not effective yet. Australia is now leading the way, so even globally we can't find IFRS S2 examples because entities are following us, and the European requirements first apply to 31 December 2024 in the process of coming out, and it's CSRD or European standards, not IFRS, aligned but not exactly the same. So the examples that the student could find for us were examples that deals with topics that is embedded in AASB S2, but it's not necessarily everything in AASB S2, not necessarily compliant. But I think good to see what people are doing. Basically, they've done these disclosures to voluntarily align with TCFD recommendations. So I thought you might find it useful. I've put the entity names there. All of this information is publicly available. We found it from their websites, but I've got little snippets. The examples that I've got here today are mostly from climate reports. So a lot of businesses to date have climate reports, and then they've got separate financial statements, etc., or directors' reports. So most of the governance disclosures we actually found in climate reports. Now, this will now move to a mandatory sustainability report as part of the annual report, etc., and it will have to comply with AASB S2. But here I've got some examples where you can see how people articulate governance. The AGL Board of Directors plays a pivotal role. It actively considers climate-related risk and opportunities when they review and set their strategy and make investment decisions. So there's a lot on the board. You can see the second last paragraph. AGL uses a skills matrix to identify the key skills and experience in the board, and they link that to climate. So just a few key things. It's good ones to, I wanted to make it easy for you to look at some examples. So this one is ANZ. They've got a diagram around your board, the key board committees. There's a board committee on ethics, environment, social and governance committee. And then you can see the key management committees. There's a key management committee on climate advisory forum. There are key management roles. So some of them address climate. So the group executive institutional drives implementation of the group's climate and environment strategy. So some of the, these are the groups, the individuals at a board and a management level. And BHP, they've got a disclosure. The board approves significant social, community and sustainability policies, including those relating to climate change and public sustainability goals and targets, etc. This one is Zero. Zero talk about board oversight, climate-related governance board oversight. They also have a separate section on management approach and all the committees and how they report together. Worley, again, has a similar diagram of committees, specific disclosures around board oversight, and you can see there's the remuneration committee as well, and the role of management across sustainability, for example. And then SEEK has governance, and Orica, again, climate change governance framework. They talk about the board, the executive committee, and remuneration, all around that. So those are a few examples. Remember, they're not AASB S2 compliant, not because they don't want to, it's just the standard wasn't available. How could they be compliant? Maybe they are. But these are examples we could see in the market to give you some ideas. on how people have dealt with it. At BDO, we would love to help you with this to get the governance in place so you can do the reporting and be assurance ready. So under sustainability reporting, we focus on mandatory reporting. It's one of the things we focus on. And these are the people looking at it at the different locations. These are our assurance partners. You can subscribe for our insights. Obviously, you are attending our webinars. It's a 1 minute past 12, so I'll say thank you very much for joining me today. I hope you find it really useful and informative. If you've got particular questions that I haven't addressed today, could you please email it to me or put it in the chat box? We do have a process where we look at those questions and go back to people that's raised questions. If I get a lot of similar questions, I address it in next month's webinar, or maybe we write a newsletter article on it. Thank you for your participation. I hope you have a lovely day, and we'll speak again next month.